Chapter 14 of Carmilla brings us back to the General's story. His niece is dying, and he's desperate for someone to save her life. The doctors say that they can't help her, and the doctor from Graz tells him that what he really needs is a priest, insisting that Bertha has been the victim of a vampire. The General can't believe what he's hearing, but nevertheless, he's fearful for his niece. And so he decides to watch over her as she sleeps. Imagine the alarm when he spies Millarca crawling into her bed. He tries to stop her with his sword, but Millarca vanishes from the scene. Sadly for the General, tragedy quickly follows, and before the morning dawned, Bertha was no longer alive. And now the General's story is over. At the tombs of Karnstein, they're having a good look around as the afternoon hours settle in. Madame Perrodon arrives with Carmilla, and suddenly the scene goes haywire when the General tries to kill the young lady. Carmilla escapes, and Laura is flabbergasted by what she has seen. The General explains Carmilla and Millarca are in fact the same person, and she is the Countess Mircalla Karnstein. A strange-looking man appears, who is known to the General as the Baron. The General is very happy to see him, because the Baron knows how to find Mircalla's tomb. But the situation is grave. Everyone knows that Laura is getting worse. She has to be taken home. But on the next day, the men return to Mircalla's tomb, where they actually find her, looking to be alive and quite well. Mircalla meets with a gruesome end, and the eradication of vampires in the Karnstein village is complete. What we learn is that with the Countess Mircalla's passing, Laura's sickness has gone away for good. In the conclusion to Carmilla, we find Laura doing her best to overcome the effects of her experience. The aforementioned narrative has been written as something of a favor for Dr. Hesselius, and Laura speaks of the terrible memories that writing it has evoked. She tells us a little about the Baron, whose full title was Baron Vordenberg. This man had come to stay with the Englishmen at the chateau, and we learn of his expertise with the study of vampires. He explains how he knew of Mircalla's grave and its location, citing his associations with the Moravian nobleman. Laura's story ends with talk of a badly needed trip to Italy, which seems to have helped with her recovery. But she claims that from time to time, she still senses Carmilla's presence. The General's problem with the doctors is reminiscent of Chris MacNeil's problem in The Exorcist. And so I'm curious, has a doctor ever told you or someone you know that you needed to see a priest instead of a doctor? Please let me know in the comments. The General's physician notes that Bertha suffers from an icy feeling against her chest, and Regan's doctors say that she suffers from a disorder of the nerves. Bertha hallucinates large cats, and Regan wants to know why her bed is shaking. Bertha claims to have been bitten by something, and Regan, she doesn't know hardly anything at all. The General's doctors, they don't know what to do, though one of them is ridiculed by the other for suggesting the need for the skills of a conjurer. Christine's doctors stare blankly at her, as one of them proffers an outlandish idea for a cure, to which she replies, The prospect of having to choose between a priest and a doctor also appears in The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and so it is that between this film, The Exorcist, and Carmilla, the lives of four characters have a unifying theme. They are young girls who suffer from inexplicable conditions of which their parents have to choose between medical and metaphysical courses of action. It's to be noted that Reagan and Emily's stories are based on true-to-life modern accounts. And it's in The Exorcism of Emily Rose that you'll find the most compelling portrayal of this situation thoroughly played out. The story of Carmilla is over, and so we're left with a few things to wonder about. Who is the woman who claimed to be Carmilla's mother? Why was she helping her? Who is Matska? And what was her role in all this? And because the gentleman in black was so pale, was he a vampire too? What will happen to these people now that Mircalla is gone? And most importantly, to me of course, what was the Englishman's name? The masquerade was a good staging ground for luring victims, but the carriage accident, in light of all this, comes off as having been staged, and that seems pretty risky. But I guess that's neither here nor there. At root, there's some kind of a conspiratorial connection here, and we have to surmise that Mircalla was somehow pulling all the strings. But it's all conjecture, wonderful, fantastic, dearly beloved conjecture. In Christopher Frayling's documentary about Dracula, he shows us the books that Bram Stoker used to help him write his novel. It speaks to the research that it takes to produce good literature. And we have to imagine Sheridan Le Fanu doing the same thing 20 years earlier. Most of the narrative is about us getting to know Carmilla and Laura, but it's in the last section that the pages explode with all kinds of information about vampires. Scholarship has it that Le Fanu utilized a number of sources to write his novella. Sheridan Le Fanu, with incisive skill, was able to compress his research and tell us, with great fascination, the strange details involved with vampire lore. My favorite one has to do with Mircalla's grip of steel, which leaves a numbness that is seldom recovered from. Carmilla is symbolic for the lesbian community because it portrays what has come to be recognized as our first account of the lesbian vampire. For my part, I can only describe this venture as highly odd. If you mention the Victorian era within scholarly circles, you will probably stir up talk of sexual repression. That's because sexual repression and Victorian society go hand in hand. It was the stuff that made Sigmund Freud a superstar. The issue here is that it was usually thought of in terms of heterosexuality. This is what makes Sheridan Le Fanu's work so highly odd. What could possibly possess him to write about a female vampire scouring the countryside for lonely girls, when he knows how his peers would have felt about the subject? However, for something like this to emerge within a time of sexual repression is not surprising, because that's what repression does. It prompts a reaction. Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray follows suit in its own subtle way. And between his book and Carmilla, we seem to have the progenitors to the LGBTQ movement itself, with the inclusion of intersex and asexual groups to follow. But the language of gender politics aside, it's the thought of a ghost story to curl up with by the fire that intrigues us most. And that's why we so ardently love the story of Carmilla.